Hello everyone, and welcome back to another GIS lecture video. And in this lecture video, we're going to continue our discussion on scale and generalization by talking about scale and sort of reminding ourselves what scale is. And we're going to tie in these topics of cartographic versus geographic scale. So if we think for a second about scale, right, there are really sort of two key concepts to scale. There's this idea of scale when we're talking about, say, for example, research or an area, right? And we typically think about that as the idea of geographic scale. Right? And so this again is the idea of, say, how big is an area, right? And so if you're creating a study, you might say, oh yeah, I have a large scale study because I have a large area or a lot of people, right? That's geographic scale. So, right, large scale equals big area, right? But more importantly for us as cartographers, and sort of the opposite idea of geographic scale, is this idea of cartographic scale. Right, and with cartographic scale, we're talking specifically about a mathematical representation, right? Or a mathematical inference. Right, it's a mathematical representation of the relationship between size on a map and size in the real world. Right, and I'm going to underline here this idea of mathematical relationship, right? Because we've already kind of talked about cartographic scale when we talked about the idea of using scale bars and representative fractions and those kinds of things. We also kind of talked about cartographic scale when we talked about that idea of the scale factor, when we talked about distortion and map projections. But here we're sort of explicitly saying that cartographic scale is simply the mathematical representation representing the relationship between the size on a map and the size in the real world. So that's sort of what scale bars and representative fractions were doing in the elements, in map elements, right? And so when we deal with scale in this class, we're dealing almost exclusively, unless I say otherwise, with this idea of cartographic scale. So when I talk about scale, I am implying cartographic scale. And the other thing to kind of keep in mind here with cartographic scale is large scale versus small scale means something very different than it does in geographic scale, right? In geographic scale, if I say, oh yeah, I had a large scale study, right, I'm implying that I had a large area or a large sample population or something like that. With cartographic scale, it's actually kind of the opposite, right? And the reason is because we're talking about a mathematical representation, right? And if we remember this idea of the representative fraction, right, the RF, right, we have the distance on the map, right, to the distance in the real world. So if we had a 1 to, say, 1,000, right, this would mean 1 unit on the map is equal to 1,000 units in the real world, right? And we call it a representative fraction because you can write it as a fraction, right? And so when we say something like large scale, let me make that a little cleaner here. Right, when we say something like large scale in terms of cartographic scale, what we mean is that the representative fraction is larger or is large, right? And because the representative fraction, right, is 1 over whatever the distance measure is in the real world, right? A large scale cartographic scale means that this number, bottom number, is smaller, meaning that 1 unit in the map represents less distance in the real world, right? So what this means, right, if the representative fraction is larger, that means that, right, the denominator of the RF of the representative fraction, right, is smaller, right? And what that also means then, as kind of like a corollary to that, right? Because if we remember the fact that the denominator of the representative fraction, right, is how much distance 1 unit on the map represents in the real world. This also means that the map, and I'm going to put this in quotes here because it's not technical, right, is more zoomed in. I'm going to put this in quotes, right? Meaning more detail. Right. So in this case, large scale means the representative fraction is larger, means more detail. Right. So large scale, large detail. Right. Conversely, when we talk about small scale, right, we are talking about the opposite here, right? The representative fraction is smaller, right? And so if instead of 1 to 1,000, maybe we had something like, right, 1 to say 100 million, right? That can be written as 1 over, right, 100 million. And so if we have that situation, right, the denominator of the RF is larger. Right? And as the denominator, right, as the bottom number gets larger, right, that means that 1 unit on the map represents more area or more distance or more length in the real world. That means that the map is kind of more zoomed out, right? Oops, I'm missing an O in zoomed, right? Is more zoomed out. Right? Or, right, you have less detail. Right? Because 1 unit on the map now represents much more length in the real world, meaning you have a more zoomed out appearance, meaning that you have less detail available to you. So the way I like to think of it, RF small scale equals the RF is smaller, meaning the denominator is larger, meaning less detail. Right? More area, less detail. Large scale, more detail, less area. And there's obviously trade-offs between the two. So the question then becomes, what do we consider large scale versus what do we consider small scale? And the answer to that is really it depends, right? There's not really like a set representative fraction that differentiates the two. And it's really somewhat of a relationship, right? Because if we have 1 to 1,000, right, that is a larger scale than say 1 to 100, right? But it's a smaller scale than say 1 to a million or 100 million, right? But just keep in mind when we talk about cartographic scale, we're talking about this mathematical representation, and that when somebody says large scale in a cartographic perspective, what they mean is that the map has a lot of detail, typically covering less area. And if they say that it's a small scale, they're typically indicating that they're covering more area with less detail. So hopefully that makes sense. And as always, if you have any questions, please reach out. Thank you.